Hi, I'm Lorna, VP of Developer Experience at Redocly. We make all sorts of different tools for OpenAPI. Some of them are open source. You might have used our command line tool or Redoc. So I want to talk today about OpenAPI, specifically for this audience. I think there's a lot of resources for engineers, but we're missing the point when we don't bring documentarians into the room, because having really great API documentation is a multiplier for developer experience. This is super important. I think you can make a big difference, and I'm hoping to show you some of the places where I think you and OpenAPI can really go together. So why OpenAPI in particular? Well, it's the most common way to describe APIs today, and I love it because it's an open standard, it's modern, it's really widely used. Because it's an open standard, it's not from a single vendor. You don't need to worry about what's coming because you can always find that out. You can have your voice heard, it's developed in the open, but also lots and lots and lots of people who make tools, either as hobbies or commercially, can implement that same standard without, having there's a lot of competition, but without being suspicious about relying on someone else's standard. So OpenAPI is a fantastic innovation in our industry. It allows us to interoperate between all the different tools all the way through our API lifecycle. And when I think about the API lifecycle, everybody's is going to look different. In my mind, we're going to design the API first, so design first APIs, perhaps the whole API, perhaps just designing the next change to an API, adding an endpoint or extending some functionality. Then we're going to implement that, we're going to build it, and then we're going to publish it to the world. So we might be delivering documentation and client SDKs at that point, but even to build it, the design needs to be solid. The advice that I will give you today, I hope, can be used for all sorts of different life cycles. So if you find yourself a bit later in the process than this, I'm still going to show you some levers that you can pull to make a difference, even if you're receiving a generated spec, and how to make that onward developer experience better. I've been thinking about this a long time. My background is in software engineering. I've been an API developer, integrator, consultant, provider, author, advocate. Now I'm working for a tools vendor. So I feel like I've been seeing the same problems from different angles for quite a large chunk of my career. And I'm pretty excited to try to bundle all this into a short amount of time and share it with you. So let's start by getting to know OpenAPI. It's a wonderful, powerful standard. However, the learning curve is non-trivial. So if you have tried OpenAPI and really felt like you were struggling, I think you're in good company, and I'm here to try to make that easier. I'm making the assumption that you are working with a docs as code workflow. So everything is stored in some kind of text-based markup. You've got tools that support you developing that probably locally. There are some great cloud tools as well. You are using source control so that you can all work simultaneously and collaborate easily across multiple changes, and that you're using the best of continuous integration so that when you open a pull request or merge a pull request, a lot of those things that need to happen are automated. A lot of the resources in Docs as code, and specifically around OpenAPI, were written by engineers, right? These are programmer tools originally, and sometimes they don't make it easy for a normal person to approach. And I'm going to try and bridge those two worlds, because I don't believe that the programmers should keep the best tools for themselves. Let's start by looking around the overall structure of OpenAPI. The OpenAPI files themselves are usually tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lines long. Very easy to get lost, but they all follow the same structure. These are the top level elements that you may find, not all of them are required, in an OpenAPI file structure. They might not be in this order, but they will always look like this at the top level. So if you have a tool that can fold things up and you fold everything up as much as you can, it will look like this. First of all, we have the OpenAPI element. All this does is state the version of OpenAPI that's being used. So this is typically 3.0, 3.1, and that means all the tools can understand which version of OpenAPI. What tune we should sing this API description to. We've got the info block. This is the information about this API. So it'll tell you things like what license it's under, whose API it is, that kind of thing. There's an external docs link. This is often omitted, but if you are developing a full developer portal, not just API reference documentation, it's really easy to assume that users come to the front page, navigate the portal, and click through to the API reference documentation. However, especially on public sites, they're very likely to land on the API reference documentation. Just go and check that there's a link back to the main developer docs. External docs is there for this, so that people can find their way around. Security defines how you can connect to the API. Some APIs have no security, some have multiple complex levels of access. Your mileage will definitely vary. We have an array of servers, so this might be if you have a test platform and a live platform, both of those could be listed here. Similarly, if you have servers in different regions, they can appear in the servers array. You'll see tags defined in a couple of different places. The tags entry at the top level defines which tags can be used. So every tag will have a name, that's how we refer to it, and also it's a description, so it's a more descriptive, I'm really good at words, a more descriptive piece of information about it, or what this means. Tags are ways of grouping endpoints together, so you'll often see like all of the account operations in one tag and all of the user operations in another. Next we have the paths section. We'll drill into a couple of these sections in more detail in a moment, but the paths section is what I think of as API reference documentation. There's a list of the URLs that you can use, and then which verbs you can call, and then what data needs to go in and what data should come back from each one of those. I've also got the webhook section here. If you have an API which can receive a request and return a response, ordinary API. If something happens over there and then it returns a response to a client, that's a webhook. And you might have seen this pattern when you push a change to GitHub and you get a notification in Slack, something like that. GitHub is sending a webhook to Slack. The webhooks are not that widely used in OpenAPI, but I wrote the specification for them, so I'm putting them in my picture. Finally, the components section. You'll often see things in the components section which can then be used and sometimes reused throughout the rest of the spec. Sometimes things are kept here for readability, sometimes they're kept here for usability. It's like the kitchen sink of things you might need to operate this API. I've got some examples for you. So let's drill into that info section, just the top part, in a bit more detail. I built this visualization to try to make it easier to reason about how these things nest inside each other. My hope is that it's easier than looking at a lot of YAML. As a person who professionally looks at a lot of YAML, I promise this gets easier and you start to read it very easily. But if you currently don't, it's really hard. So we've got to start somewhere, and I built this visualization for you. In the info section, we have a title. Please give your API a title, a meaningful title. In the future, all our APIs will be discovered in catalogs. They'll be listed in directories full of other APIs. The metadata that we put here in the info section is how users will find us and understand that they found the right thing. It's also going to be super unusual for any organization to only have one API. So don't skip on any of these fields in the info section, even if your chosen documentation tool doesn't render them all. because it's very likely that they will be used in future. So it is an investment and it does matter. Okay, discoverability rant over. What are the other fields? Okay, so I've got summary and description. Almost every element in OpenAPI has both these fields. Summary is used when we're displaying a list of things, and description is displayed when we're only showing one thing. So that's my generalization. That summary is a few words, it's going to be shown in a list, maybe in the navigation. Description is going to be shown when we're looking at just this one thing. That's true here on the info level, it's true on the operation level, it's true in other places as well. A couple of other really important things that I've included here. There are more fields, but we'd be here all day. I just picked my favorites without making the font size too small, I hope. So, version. This is the version of your API description. It doesn't have to be tied to the current live version of the API, right? Because you might make big document description changes without changing the API, like it didn't have any error documentation and now it does. That's a big change. You want to increment your document version. Or you might lock it to your API. I don't really care. But if you make big changes, please update the version so that people can check that they have the most recent version of the documentation. This is in contrast to that OpenAPI field right at the top. That's the version of OpenAPI we're using. Info version is the version of this document. Okay. License. Please give your API a license, even if it's all rights reserved or something, because without a license, nobody knows if they can use it or not. So do always make sure you have this. You can either use the identifier or there's a URL format for this as well. So this is the pretty picture version. This is the same thing in YAML, except I can squeeze the external docs on here when I do it this way. So it's exactly the same thing. Oh, one thing I meant to mention about summary and description. The summary is text. The description can be markdown. So here I have it with that pointy bracket as the opening. What's the technical term for this? Somebody type it in chat, please. Right, we can do in OpenAPI, we can put markdown in description fields. So you can put markdown in your description fields. Great start. If you start with that pointy bracket, then that gives you, it's technically called folded text. So you can just put the line breaks wherever you want and the text will come out without the line breaks. More common, especially for that info description, which is often very long and descriptive, you can start with a pipe character, and that is like writing in a markdown file. So you can do titles and bullet points and those things all work. So that is called wrapped text. Don't overcook this with formatting. It's here if you need it. It's especially useful if you want to link out to other resources, lists of error codes, tutorials on how to do a thing, more information, sign up, API key, sign up, all sorts of things. I'm so often asked what the difference is between the summary and the description. They're displayed in different contexts and they kind of do different things. You probably want both, even though most documentation tools only display one or the other in any given context. I think the descriptions, and perhaps even more so the summaries, because microcopy is an art, are where technical writers, communicators, I like to call you documentarians, can really make a huge difference to an API experience by going beyond user ID, the ID of the user, and being user ID starts with a U, get yours in your account page. It's used for linking you to your library book records, whatever, right? Just trying to put something across that's a little bit more than the very basics. Every API is different, you get to choose who you are. Paths. This is the meat, the kind of main section of the API. In the paths section. We describe each of the URLs that are supported, each of the endpoints for this API. And within each one of those, so I've got 2 in this picture, and within each one of those, the verb that can be used and the different operations underneath those. So you can see here I've got a couple of different URLs. The first one, /item/endpoint, only supports a single get operation. And the second one, I clearly was feeling inspired with example values when I was creating this slide deck. We can do both get to get a list of things and post to create a thing on this things, another URL, collection endpoint. If I drill into one of those paths in more detail, you start to get a sense of how this works. First up, I've got the operation ID. Now, technically, OpenAPI makes operation ID optional. This is a mistake. I mean, it isn't, right? Because the whole point of OpenAPI is that it can describe a whole raft of different types of API. And operation ID is often not front and center when you're developing an API using the preview tools. It's an optional field. A lot of tools will suggest that you need one. It's used in a bunch of places. In documentation tooling, you will see it as the anchor fragment really often. So having something that's meaningful can really help, especially where a user has bookmarked a bunch of endpoints to go back to. They can tell which one it is. This piece of information, this label, also gets used in a bunch of other places. When you're generating client SDKs, for example, it is usually used as like a function name, that sort of thing. So it does get used, users will see it. I would recommend you have it and you add a linting rule to make sure it's unique, otherwise things get really confusing. Despite having said you would need a summary and a description, I've only got a description here. There's only so much space on the page. And I've added some tags. This is the other type of tags. So within an operation, you can tag with any of those tag names, and it supports multiple ones. Not all tools know what to do with multiple tags, but the specification requires that you can tag it any way you like. I've got one response here, and if this endpoint also returned 401 or 403, if it needs some authentication or any other status code, then you would see the 200 and the 301, the 403, whatever. You would see all of those here. I've just got one under responses, and it's a 200 response. I'm going to drill into the response. I've got some schemas in there. The way that we do parameters and request bodies with schemas in is pretty similar to the response. So I've just got the response one to show you kind of how that data payload then gets nested. In the response, sort of shuffled down the page a bit, but you're looking at the same endpoint, I've expanded that schema so you can see, that 200 response, content type application JSON, it's a success, that's what the description says. Again, you could write a bit more if that's appropriate for the endpoint. And then we've got the schema. My schema contains 2 fields. The first one is message, it's a string. And the second one is an event ID, it's an integer. And the integers are different for each type of event that there can be. So I've got a little description denoting that. A lot of APIs have a lot of fields, and this all gets very complicated. It wouldn't work very well in my visualization. But this is the idea, that you have all these different fields, you describe their types, you add a description so that people know what they're about, and then you can add an example. Meaningful examples for parameters and schemas are literally worth 1,000 words. We say it about pictures, forget pictures. Examples is where it's at, because it makes the user really get it, right? When I'm developing content or communicating with customers, I always choose silly examples. My stuff often contains cupcakes or unicorns. And if you make someone smile, not just, it feels nice, right? You've tickled their brain just a little bit, and it helps them to digest the information. Always try and keep it really inclusive. I saw an incredible article the other day about enabling more audiences by choosing examples that are not just Star Wars. And I haven't seen Star Wars, so I am massively on board with that. And, you know, sometimes the small, the silly, the dog, the cat, the red, the yellow, the green, we can all relate to that. And it just helps everyone to feel like this example was for them. Your example messages here might be, you look nice today, right? Whatever you like. So that's a schema example, something that goes alongside a single field. And I really think that examples, a bit like the microcopy for the summaries, are an art, and they're something that we, as good communicators, can really bring to the API experience table. The other place where examples are incredible is response examples. Now, OpenAPI allows for each response to have multiple examples, and those examples have names. The majority of tooling will understand those names. You can use them for tests. The mock servers will return them. You can show all of the options when you're doing documentation. Often you'll see a drop down. So having named examples is really powerful. Here I've just got 2 event examples, right, where the message is that a new user registered and there's an event ID, and then user login looks different. So if we'd registered a user and we were going to include the user object in that message, it will look a bit different to the other one, and that's where having the multiple examples is really useful. You can also include an example of your error response, which can really help a developer to understand how to handle that exception. Hopefully you're also providing sandboxes so they can easily activate it, but also from just reading the docs, they can see what they should expect. Examples are something that don't necessarily come naturally, a bit like really great descriptions, from engineering teams. Some can do it for sure. I'm not saying that engineers can't do docs or shouldn't do docs or shouldn't be expected to do docs. I know that there are some parts of engineering culture that have some contempt for documentation, but I've never met a great engineer who wasn't really good at docs. So yeah, think about that. It may be that you need to add these yourself as a later step, and this is quite tricky when the OpenAPI is updating, but there are tools available where you can add things on. Redocly has decorators, OpenAPI is working on an overlays standard. There are ways to extend and kind of complete that OpenAPI documentation if you are dealing with a generated spec, which tends to be a little bit more limited. Okay. This is the same slide again, before I went on a tangent about examples. we were looking at schema structures, and my schema has 2 fields. Okay. OpenAPI makes extensive use of references and the components section. And you can take this potentially very long-winded object definition, put it in components, and just refer to it. This can make your API description a bit more readable. And it also means that everywhere we use that event ID, we refer to the same event ID object because it's there in components and it can be reused. If we start adding some validation to this, or we extend the explanation, it'll be there in every field. So you can say goodbye to find and replace on examples, descriptions, or whatever on long API documentation. I am sure you have been there. I know I have. The way that we do this is, I'm going to stay with this response example, right? We've got this response example. It's got 2 fields. I'm going to replace those 2 fields that describe the data in its entirety with 2 references. So we're just referencing out to the components section. The components section can contain parameters, schemas, request bodies, all sorts of responses, all sorts of things. Here I'm referring in the components schemas section, and all I've done is take the fields that we had before and put them under components. So in components, in schemas, So imagine those nested inside each other. There's our message, there's our event ID, and we just referred to them wherever we need them. I think understanding the structure of OpenAPI can really help you find your way around and find the places where you're really going to make a difference. To do that, you need really good tooling, and I'm going to try and just talk a little bit about that before I wrap up. Making tools recommendations is super hard. There are loads of tools in this API space. OpenAPI is just JSON or YAML, and honestly I could argue passionately for or against either of those formats. So you need tools that can handle that. There's new tools all the time, and it sort of depends on your tech stack, what you're already familiar with. These are the things that you need. So I have put openapi.tools here. This is a community-driven directory of all of the available API tools. It literally updates every week. So when you want to adopt some OpenAPI tools, whether that's tomorrow or in 3 months, you need to go there and have a look around, because it might be obvious that there's something that's built that will be a plugin for a tool that you use or something you're familiar with or have a license for. Look here first. Also, I work for a tools vendor. There is no way that I should be recommending tools because I am completely and unashamedly biased. Right, I love the stuff Readocly makes. The best editor to use for OpenAPI is the one that you know. I'm sure most of you are working with some sort of rich text editors or programmer tools. I am a big advocate of using a really solid coding IDE and having plugins that are going to help you work with OpenAPI. There are also some graphical editors, so check those out if that is more your style. I think I have a blog post about this. This is pre-recorded, Lorna. If you could ask live in chat, Lorna, to find you the blog post. I'm using VS Code with a bunch of plugins. Readocly have an OpenAPI plugin, have a YAML folding plugin, and I think it's called Indent Rainbow. Every indent is a different color, so you can kind of tell if you've got your indentations wrong somewhere, because that can be pretty tricky. Again, spend enough time with YAML, you get your eye in. I can spot a 1 space error at 5 paces now, but particularly if you are not doing this 100% of your time or just learning, it's hard to see. So the plugins can really help, and you can get a docs preview built into whichever editor you're using as well. A bunch of them have them. It's not technically a tool, but it's really important. API governance is what makes the difference, and this is it a process? It's more like a mindset. It's more like a philosophy. OpenAPI governance is about the way that you build and share APIs with the world. You need a bunch of standards. Write those things down. If they're not written down, they're not standards. Use humans to check changes. Yeah, I'm going to talk about linting in a minute, but if you name your endpoint parameter object something so stupid that no one knows what it is. I once worked for a company that had 3 different meanings of the word account in their API. Just take a moment and crowdsource from your expert stakeholders. Should we really call this? Before you publish. Because the thing is, in documentation, if you publish something and you need to change it, you can change it. And it doesn't even usually have that many side effects. Each page is different. In code, if you need to change something, you can usually iterate. It's more likely to have side effects with functions in other files. In APIs, if you need to change something, you need to also support the mistake that you made until the end of time. It's really worth getting this stuff right before you release. Ask me how I know. CI, continuous integration, GitHub Actions, for every change you make can take a lot of the load. Make sure you are doing some quality checks, maybe running some tests, deploying some docs, deploying a mock server. Let the machines do the things that they can do. And if you are retrofitting this to your organization, just start small. Add 3 rules to the system and generate some docs. It makes it easier to get feedback from people. Let the machines do the work, but only the things they are qualified to do. Machines are very good at validating OpenAPI, enforcing descriptions, making sure that every parameter schema has an example, following naming conventions. So if you always name your date fields as something underscore date, you can make a linting rule for that. This should say configure the rule sets for your needs. I'll fix this when I upload the slides. Making sure that the tools that you choose can be configured easily in a way that you don't have to turn off whole rules, but you can make them fit what you need and add in the things that aren't necessarily mainstream but make sense for your context. There are absolutely loads of choices for linting tools. Obviously, Redocly makes one of them. Tech support is always available, but look around and see what would fit maybe with what you already have. OpenAPI documentation. Please read the docs for your docs tool. Make sure you're getting the best from it. There are lots and lots of hidden gems in every API docs tool I've ever used, and hardly anyone goes beyond the code generated the OpenAPI generated the HTML, and we published the HTML. You can do so much more. Again, look at the examples. Look at how you can tag things. Look at how you can link between stuff. By adding the docs into your pull request workflow, it's an easy way to put that change in front of stakeholders. And it's also a nice way to see a new endpoint in context. When you deploy your documentation, make sure you're tracking some metrics, even if it's only page views. You need to prove that what you do makes a difference. We know that this is important to developers, so get some metrics that helps to show that to your wider organization. API documentarians, you are the secret sauce, right? You are making API experiences great. I saw in the Postman State of API report, this is 2022's, I'm not sure if 2023's is out, 55% of people said that lack of documentation was the obstacle for consuming APIs. What you do enables developers to do amazing things. It's really important work, and I just want to take a moment to thank you for the work that you do in making APIs easier to use. I'm going to leave you with a few resources. My own blog, where I write some of this down sometimes. Redocly, check out the tools. Let me know if you have questions anytime. I'm not hard to find on the internet. The OpenAPI.tools site that I recommended to go and look for tools that will fit with your workflow and your preferences. And of course the State of API report, because I just cited it. Thanks very much.
So good to see you. What a really fun talk, a very engaging talk about APIs of all things.
That APIs are fun, and I defy anyone who says otherwise.
No, you have made the case for APIs being fun. Thank you very much for doing that. It was really a very interesting talk. So we don't really have a lot of time for questions, but I have one. Do you have a style guide for the text in the description, like sentence length, maximum number of characters, and that kind of thing?
I don't, and I think it really depends. So we try to use some of the same rules we use in the rest of our documentation. So I like to have active voice, no future tense, consistency of spellings, surprisingly difficult. And if you can catch misspellings in descriptions, you may also catch them in parameter naming before things get published. So I don't have especially strong style guides. And also those things are actually quite hard to apply. I feel like the tooling for pros in documentation just isn't there at the moment. I'm working for Redocly. We have some extensions that mean you can include markdown descriptions from separate files, which means you can apply styles and formatting checks there. And I think that can really help, but it's difficult to apply.
Okay, well, that's really good advice. Thank you. Let's see. I just want to say before we end the Q&A, the conference closing is going to be presented live right after our final Q&A session. So after that last talk, everybody should join us here in Q&A, listen to the Q&A, and then we'll hear a closing for this actually just beautiful conference we've had. I've enjoyed it so much. And thank you so much, Lorna. You have added so much to it.